you mentioned your 6 pre-draft objectives was to go full 0 RB with your draft build, execute a final build with good running back, wide receiver balance, draft the elite tight end that we want to get. You want to get 2 quarterbacks in the window. Look at those ADP values and try and emphasize on those. You mentioned some of the guys falling that we're going to touch on in just a moment, and then load up on the priority targets in the side rankings. And one thing then to look into is the players you drafted. People are going to want to know who are the guys on this perfect roster. So opening up the draft, you are in spot 6, and in this draft it did go Jonathan Taylor, Christian McCaffrey, then Kupp, Jefferson, and then Travis Kelce went at 5. So even at that point, there is times when you're at that 6th spot that, you know, Chase, Kupp, and Jefferson are all gone. Maybe Diggs becomes the option then. But in this situation, you had Jamar Chase as your option. And I think that's a very straightforward pick at that point. Wraps into the 2nd round, you get Deebo Samuel, who we've drafted a good few times together, then wraps back around to get that elite tight end and Kyle Pitts in the 3rd, which that is right in his wheelhouse of where he's going mid-3rd round, sometimes early 3rd round, but doesn't really fall much past that. And then in the 4th round, you have Deontay Johnson. So you're starting off with Chase, Samuel, Pitts, and Deontay Johnson. How are you feeling after those first 4 picks? And is there any specific ones in those first 4 that you want to highlight for any specific reason?
Well, when you have the 106, you're just desperately hoping that one of the drafters ahead of you will take someone from outside the normal top 5. And I got lucky in this one. Kelce does go early. That's not to say Kelce will be a bad pick if he has the type of season that he often has. He could be the league winner. He could be the tournament winner. But to have Chase fall here is the complete dream scenario. I wouldn't be surprised at all if he's the 2023 101. To get him here and then with a pretty substantial tier break after that point. Again, you could see some players like Derrick Henry or Austin Eckler be the league winner from 2022, but there is a tier break there. You get very lucky. That puts you in good position then the rest of the way, because these middle picks give you a lot of flexibility to hit ADP values as they fall and to build your construction the way that you want. And so Deebo Samuel comes there in round 2. There are some potential red flags with him. We're drafting on the talent and the scenario where that works out, just a lot more upside than some of their players, a lot more talent even than someone like Tyreek Hill, who goes to the next slot. Kyle Pitts, you mentioned. I've been missing on Pitts because of the draft slot that I had and because there were some backs like Saquon Barkley and Javonte Williams who sometimes fall into that range. Now, Javonte was still on the board here, but I've kind of moved back in the direction of trying to get as much Pitts as possible. I think that is going to be one of the draft selections that really dictates, again, this 2022 season. There are some concerns at the quarterback position there. Already some whispers that Desmond Ridder will be making a start sooner than later. When you consider the fact that a lot of people were not on him as someone who really is an NFL starter, then that gives you a little bit of concern perhaps. But I mean, the upside for him to be a 1,400-yard, 12-touchdown player and just absolutely annihilate the rest of the guys who are kind of in that range. Again, we're talking about how do we draft players who could be in the top 5 picks next year. Kyle Pitts could be in the top 5 picks next year. He could be going where Travis Kelce went in this draft at the 105. I think his chances to outscore Kelce this year are really pretty close. I wouldn't say even, but he's someone we're going to prioritize. And then Deontay Johnson was selected at the 2-3 turn of the MFL 10 of death. We talked about that in that article and on the show, the pluses and minuses for him. I think if Trubisky starts instead of Pickett, then that sort of raises his floor, especially in the early going. Deontay Johnson, probably a value there in round 4. His target profile much better than a lot of the wide receivers selected ahead of him.
Yeah, I think all very, very good points there. And I think Pitts was somebody who we drafted on that stream with Rich Rebar. And, you know, it doesn't take a lot from his season last year if he adds in those touchdowns to just make him an absolute, he already is a superstar, but a true difference maker when it comes to these early round and elite tight end options. Rounds 5 through 8, then we move in. We get Rashad Bateman. We get, I'm looking forward to hearing you talk about Bateman. I'm really starting to fall in love with Bateman for this season. Amon-Ra St. Brown, who finished the season very strong, had a really good year for the Lions overall last year. And then you do take that first running back, and I'm going to let you reveal that when it gets to your portion. Then we move into a quarterback who we've really liked picking up this year, and we've talked about a lot in the podcast. That is Trey Lance. I think his rushing ability, you paired him then as well with Deebo Samuel, who you took earlier in the draft. I'm interested as well to get your thoughts for these tournaments in particular about the stacking and also potentially mixing in those week 17 scenarios, how much weight you're putting into those this year. So I'll let you go through that, but I'll let you reveal the running back as well.
Well, you mentioned Rashad Bateman, and there are some ways those wouldn't work out, but I do like him as a little bit of an arbitrage play, and using that term obviously very loosely, but play on Mark Andrews, who is going earlier. Andrews, we absolutely love the talent. I'm not suggesting people not select him, but if the Ravens do become much more run heavy again and the target volume is way down overall, then I think we need to look at some less expensive ways to play it. Now, you say, well, Rashad Bateman is an unproven wide receiver in the 5th round. How is that inexpensive? And yet again, we're really trying to find some wide receiver plays that will work. The guys around him here are Chris Godwin, who, you're going to get late season production, hopefully. And there's the best case scenario where Godwin performs right off the bat. We just don't know how these players are going to recover as people recover faster and faster. But it's tricky to select someone who suffered a serious injury at the very end of last season here in round 5. Juju Smith-Schuster, a lot of upside, a lot of downside. Amari Cooper. I'm surprised that Cooper hasn't fallen more with the news coming out around Deshaun Watson. Someone like David Bell is falling. And yeah, you could say that these guys who aren't proven, the peripheral receivers, maybe not having elite quarterback play hurts them more. But Cooper was already a questionable pick in this range to start with, and now it looks like he may have very poor quarterback play. Then you have Darnell Mooney, and Mooney is someone that Connor and I selected in the Underdog draft that we currently have going on. Mooney is one of these guys where I probably should be selecting him more. I like that one. But Rashad Bateman jumps out as being the number one and one of these second-year players where you're talking about the second-year leap. How can you get the second-year leap without paying or overpaying for it? Well, you need to take someone who was not actually awesome as a rookie, but who had a fantastic prospect profile and is now in a situation where they have huge target volume with target share. Now, we don't know how large the pie is going to be, but his target share is going to be huge, and he's going to be catching passes from Lamar Jackson. We know Jackson can push the ball down the field. We know that they can score quickly and score a lot. So I think that's a risk that you have to take. Then we're looking at 2 more guys here with this second-year leap potential, Amon-Ra versus Elijah Moore. I flipped on them a little bit, in part because Garrett Wilson gives you a cheaper way to play the Jets, also because Amon-Ra has established this strong rapport with Jared Goff, where only one of Elijah Moore's big games came with Zach Wilson. I still think that Elijah Moore is the better prospect, probably has the bigger long-term future. Amon-Ra is going to have a little bit more overall target competition down the line, but we don't know for sure yet what Jameson Williams is going to be able to do this year either. He's in that Chris Godwin category where those guys probably only contribute at the very end. So we take Amon-Ra. He's one of these guys too, where if you do have some interest in Jared Goff, very easy to put those guys together. Then we come to the running back. And the running back is the controversial choice here, right? When we get into round 7, we talk about going sort of hardcore or pure zero RB in some of the redraft types of formats. That will work really well. Blair and I had a team where we drafted our first running back in round 11 in the 2020 FFPC main event. That team finished 31st overall. The roster construction explorers do like you not to wait too long for your first running back in best ball, in part because we're going to just be working with this one group of guys. And so that you want a little bit of exposure to some backs who maybe have the scoring profile that you're starting to see here. Now, one of the things that's so fun about 2022 is that maybe it's a little bit more difficult to find the wide receiver value, but the running back value now, when you're looking at guys in round 7, like Antonio Gibson, names you wouldn't necessarily expect. Now, AJ Dillon, a backup, I think that one you can kind of understand. Edwards-Helaire, even since this draft happened in the middle of last week, I feel like has lost a lot of value. Jerick McKinnon, just horrible for him. But Gibson's someone who, yeah, he's potentially going to lose some high value touches to JD McKissic. He hasn't really thrived as this receiver, despite the fact that he played some in college. One of the things you have to consider with Gibson is one of the reasons that he moved from receiver to running back is that the receiving element was not wide receiver quality, right? So that part, I mean, I think that in some ways the fantasy community has maybe been looking at that in the reverse of what is actually the case. And that's not to say that Antonio Gibson is a bad receiver or that we shouldn't be encouraged by the fact that he does have some element of that in his profile. But the main thing with Gibson is he is this fantastic athlete. We know he scored a lot of touchdowns. He's dropped really late here because that Brian Robinson selection then threatens to squeeze him from the other side. And I think you have to have your eyes wide open when you select him and know that there are some serious downside risks. I also am a skeptic about the Washington offense with Carson Wentz. It was pretty funny. I don't know if it came out yesterday or the day before, if that's just when I was seeing it, but some quotes out of Indianapolis talking about how like Matt Ryan is the greatest quarterback of all time. And you know that kind of reaction is occurring because of the extreme frustration that they had with Carson Wentz last year. And so the contrast for them is making them feel like Matt Ryan is peak Peyton Manning. This Washington offense is probably not going to be elite, but Antonio Gibson, when you're talking about round 7, and the fact that he is still the starter and will still receive some high value touches, and you look at him there, one of the things we talk about with a selection like Nick Chubb and say, okay, well, Nick Chubb is one of the best running backs, if not the best running back in the NFL. And if Kareem Hunt were to get hurt, then not only is he a good second or third round pick, but he's a good pick like in the top 5-6 spots. Well, we've seen that kind of play out to where even in that case, someone like D'Ernest Johnson has played more than we would want. You can make that bet a little bit better in round 7 because you're not paying nearly as much. Now, Antonio Gibson, not the same type of player, but again, a fantastic athlete. And if they lose one of these guys behind him, then it's very easy for him then to slide into this type of role to where you would feel very comfortable taking him in the 3rd round or seeing him as a 3rd round value or even a 2nd round value. Obviously, he's been drafted in that range recently because that was the hope. And so I think that you want to have a little bit of the post-hype buying on someone who, number one, is a fantastic athlete, and number two, is still in this position to get a lot of touches.
Moving into rounds 9 and 12, and a question I'm going to have for you at the end of this is that Antonio Gibson pick, after you ended up getting some of our absolute favorite players at the running back position over the next kind of 5 or 6 rounds, would you change that in hindsight? We'll leave that to the end. We go in, then we have Devin Singletary, who I think is my favorite running back pick on those 0 RB builds at the moment. Then we get Chase Edmonds, Isaiah Spiller, who, if anything does happen to Ezekiel Elliott, the upside of a 3 down back there is just enormous. And then you do pair that off with Justin Fields, Chicago Bears quarterback. So really nice stretch there. A key stretch for those 0 RB builds is that 9 through 12 range, and I think you've really paired it off very, very nicely there.
Yeah, so Devin Singletary, I'm surprised he's not going earlier, even though I understand why there would be enthusiasm for James Cook. Now, Cook, there were a lot of red flags on his prospect profile. He's one of these smaller guys, usually in fantasy, that tends to get faded as opposed to targeted, but he is very fast. He can create the big plays. That's a good fit for the Buffalo offense. I like that element of it. I think if you miss on Singletary, you want to get some exposure to Cook. Idea a little bit less expensive than where he's going in drafts. But Singletary with the hot finish, I mean, you're talking about the guy who had the best combination of playoff, semifinal, and finals advance rates last season. The best combination of those 3. He's the only back in football with an evasion rate above 20% in each of the last 2 years. I think people are wrong on Singletary's talent. And I think that they are not pricing the potential for him to have a very valuable workload quite accurately. That's not to say that I think that I'm right and everybody else is wrong, because it could easily work out that the offense goes right back to where it was the first, 10, 11, 12 weeks where he's not very involved. You're like, I mean, this guy is a cut candidate, not just someone that we're not starting or not wanting to draft, but someone we might cut to waivers. That potential is there. And so I understand why he's falling. I think the price for me is still very favorable to pick someone up who I think is more talented than perception indicates. Then you go to Chase Edmonds, and this is one of these really complicated and congested backfields. Ben and I talked about this quite a bit on our AFC breakdown of the toughest teams to project in the AFC. If you want a little bit more detail on kind of how we're looking at that, you can jump over to that episode. But I did think it was interesting that there are only 4 backs last year that have a higher route percentage than Chase Edmonds and also generated more yards per route. Obviously, DeAndre Swift, Alvin Kamara, Austin Eckler, and Leonard Fournette are all going very early. Chase Edmonds, a massive discount on those guys. Obviously, that's not the only reason those players are being drafted that Edmonds is in this range, but he's also one of these guys. He tied for the lead in yards before contact per attempt last year. That's something that I've had really good success targeting throughout the years on zero RB builds, going back to 2013-ish. It wasn't an explicit focus before that, but definitely the backside targeted from 2008 to 2013 when I was building up all of the sort of foundation for how well this works and having such great success with it in drafts, back there before it was something that was really out. Not to say that people weren't drafting teams like that, but there was something that wasn't talked about in the same way. These types of players have been very effective. Blair Andrews has done some great research showing that the yards before contact are not priced at the same way as the yards after contact in terms of efficiency, right? So the yards after contact, people are paying a lot for. The yards before contact, they're not paying as much as they should. Something to consider. Isaiah Spiller, again, we go back to Blair, one of his recent wrong reads, talks about why Spiller fits a key criterion for explosive upside. I think after you've looked at that, not that you weren't targeting Spiller anyway, he's been someone who's been a mild target for us, I think, when he falls into the right spot, but his contingency-based upside, absolutely huge. Some of the things that came out during the draft process would indicate that Spiller is not an elite talent. He's probably not going to be a long-term starter. But if you're talking about stretches of effectiveness within the context of an elite offense, I mean, if there's any place in the entire NFL that Isaiah Spiller could have gone, the Los Angeles Chargers are probably number one. Defenses are going to have to deal with Justin Herbert. He's a perfect fit for what they do, could get a lot of high-value touches. And then Justin Fields, we consistently talk about, 2 QBs in the window. We talked about how that window is moving up and now looks to be kind of closing out in the round 10 range. But again, in terms of this being the zero RB dream draft, you look at the specific rankings for QBs and where that kind of fits within the window. And ADP, people moving around a little bit. Justin Fields is the last guy who was in the window. So if you can get him again in round 12 instead of round 10, something like that, if you can get him after Tua and after Cousins, and those guys are going above him on average, they don't go above him in every draft. But if you can get him right there and have a couple of hybrid quarterbacks, that doesn't mean it's going to work out, but it gives you more paths to these high scores than for a pass-based QB. Maybe you say the pass-based QB has a better floor because we've already established that they're good. And so, that makes some sense too. It's not something we've necessarily established with Tua, but he has those elite weapons. But that's the idea with Fields. As Fields lands, you have multiple paths for each guy and then multiple guys where the upside could be significant with the rushing value we expect them to bring to the table.
And then into those late rounds, I'm just going to run through the players. I might get you to pick 1 or 2 of them, but we have Cole Kmet at tight end, Kenneth Gainwell, Wendell Robinson, Noah Fant. We'll never be able to get off the Noah Fant train, Sean, will we? And then we have Brian Robinson and Julio Jones. So very nice finish to that draft as well, in which you called the perfect zero RB draft build for 2022. But any of those guys you want to highlight, maybe that we haven't talked that much about this season, and then we'll get into those follow-up questions that I teased earlier on.
Well, a little bit the same way that Mooney is actually someone who played well last year and now has this very large volume opportunity. Kmet didn't necessarily establish himself in the same way, but he's one of these emerging types of players. If he plays even moderately well, he's going to be an absolute smash at the tight end position. You get him there with Fields, and you can kind of play that matchup in week 17 with Detroit. which we have Amon-Ra St. Brown on this roster. I really like that play. I think he should be more expensive. Gainwell, we've talked about a lot. Wan'Dale Robinson, we've talked a lot about. Noah Fant, I wasn't necessarily looking for the 3 tight ends in this build because of Kyle Pitts early, but I think that Fant is so inexpensive compared to where he should be that you have to occasionally add him here late when he falls to you then even below his ADP that's already a crazy value. Noah Fant, yeah, I mean, he's in a horrible situation, but he's been in these bad situations before. Maybe it's just that you and I have very good feelings about him because he was a big part of our week 17 push last year in the FFPC best ball tournament, where he scores that late touchdown to really elevate us another couple of spots. But Noah Fant, a great value at the price. If they were to add Garoppolo or Mayfield, then suddenly you're talking about a player who should be drafted like 6 rounds earlier. So I think that you have to move a little bit of that in. One of the things we do see with the RCE is that these 3 tight end builds, it kind of looks like it's going to be a situation where the 3 tight end helps you with playoff advance, having the elite tight end, and then having some extra shots late at the other positions, maybe help you with semifinal advance. We'll see how that develops. I think that in this case, you have to be aware of the fact that when you go away from the RCE to take values that are this extreme, when you're betting on a player, I mean, every other player in that round to me looks like a pure flyer. And if you're getting a guy who is a far above average player at his position in the NFL and is a starter, and you're drafting them against flyers, then I think you have to make that play.
No, I would agree there as well. When we get back then to the questions that I teased at the start, it was firstly the running back one where you've really ended up with a strong core of, I guess we'll say, our ideal 0 RB targets. We've talked about Gainwell, Isaiah Spiller, you touched on today, Chase Edmonds, Devin Singletary. You did do the detour to Antonio Gibson. In hindsight, knowing the running backs you got, do you still think you would go in there and get Antonio Gibson at that point?
I think so. I mean, ideally you would get someone even better, even more exciting. I had the chance to take Edwards-Helaire. I'm glad I didn't go that route with the news that came out right afterward. Ken Walker perhaps gives you more upside with the Seahawks. You want to take a shot at these elite rookies early before they get so expensive that you're drafting them in positions where they can't really beat whatever their ADP is at that point. But he is going to be dealing with Rashaad Penny. We think it could be a worse backfield situation than with Washington. And then there's a little bit of a tier break and wait, and you're able to get the rest of those guys anyway. One of the things that we do want to make sure we do in these 0 RB teams is to select good running backs. I think that's one of the sort of misconceptions with 0 RB is that you don't care about the position at all, or that you're willing to go through and not get good players. One of the things that we just have to look at from last year and how that played out is that drafters who selected James Conner and Leonard Fournette, they were not just getting filler types of guys. They were getting full-blown bell cow league winners. The drafters who selected Cordero Patterson very late got something close to that for the vast majority of the year. And then drafters who selected players like Rashaad Penny and Devin Singletary, I mean, again, you're getting elite play, not just filler types of performances. We had a show recently, Colm, on the 0 RB mistakes or 0 RB don'ts. And one of the things that maybe we didn't even attack enough or emphasize enough in that show is that you want to draft good running backs. You want to draft guys who you believe are going to go out there and be stars. It's not a thing of, okay, well, we're going to be content with, or we're going to sort of resign ourselves to the fact that we're not going to get running back scoring. That's not the case. And we're still going after these big running back scores. And there are some specific profiles you need to attack to make sure you do that.